the panelists up for this session on funding climate action, new directions. We have a really stellar group of panelists across the private sector, philanthropy, and intergovernmental organizations. We have Simon Harford, who's the CEO of the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet. We have Nandita Sahgal-Tully, who is the managing director of the Thomas Lloyd Group. And then I think online, we should have a couple of speakers as well. We have Keith Tuffley, who is the global co-head of Sustainability and Corporate Transitions Group at Citi, and Jagjit Sareen, who is the Assistant Director General of the International Solar Alliance. And here we have Delphine Voeltzel, Managing Director for Asia for OMERS Infrastructure. So we've been hearing this morning about the importance and urgency of climate action and climate finance. We know that we're already feeling the impacts of climate change, from forest fires to heat waves to extreme weather events and flooding in many different parts of the world. Climate change is already happening. And we know that we can't afford to wait. The time to act is now. There's an urgency to be able to implement climate action. And finance and climate finance is extremely important for both transitioning the economy and helping to get real economy actors, businesses, industries to transition to being green and the amount of investment required for that. But it's also really important, as Minister Yadav was just pointing out, to be able to build the resilience of billions of vulnerable people. So there's an agenda on finance that covers all aspects of climate. And we also know that even though the challenge is enormous, it presents a tremendous opportunity. According to the new climate economy, investing in climate action could result in $26 trillion of gain in this decade alone. And according to the World Bank, investing in $1 in transitioning to a green economy results in benefits of $4 on average. At the same time, we know that not enough is flowing into emerging economies and developing countries. For every $20 invested in developed markets in the energy transition, only $1 has been invested in emerging markets in the energy transition. So with that sort of context, I'd like to ask Simon, from the kind of seat at which you sit, which is sort of bringing together various sort of philanthropic actors in the Global Energy Alliance and working with a wide ecosystem of actors. What do you think is the role that different types of capital and different types of finance can play, and how can they work together?
Thank you, Priya, and good morning, everybody. Just quickly to explain the Global Energy Alliance, because we're a new organization. As Priya was saying, we are a coalition of philanthropy, of major philanthropy, seeking to play our role alongside everybody else in successful transitions. Our backers, our anchor backers, are Rockefeller Foundation, IKEA Foundation, and Jeff Bezos. But we're a coalition of all. We work closely with our friends at Bloomberg and other philanthropies seeking to play our role. My answer to your question is I think we need all forms of finance, and crucially to try and get it coordinated, because the more coordinated it is, the faster and more effective is the progress. So to echo what Lord Grimstone said, we are clear the private sector capital is most profoundly important because it's the largest pot of capital. But crucially also, when it's a private sector solution, it's more likely to be sustainable and self-fulfilling in its enduring impact. So that's a fundamental part of it. The concessional capital world, the development banks and the DFIs, also very important, particularly around areas of grid strengthening and infrastructure that might not yet either attract private capital or the governments may not want it to be in private sector hands. But there should be a returnable form of investment in that. I would also talk about government capital, not necessarily in large quantities, but again, echoing earlier speakers, the government plays a crucial role in the enabling environment. So I think it's important they're seen as a very specific actor in playing their part, both in terms of the policies and the enablers and the regulations and the predictable outlook for the sector, because that is fundamental to unlocking private capital. And then lastly, philanthropy. where we believe we do have a role in the areas of a transition that are not naturally financeable by the other categories. Most importantly, in keeping us all focused on the inclusivity of an energy transition, particularly those who don't yet have access to electricity, which does still is still an issue even in India, who've done a fantastic job with greater levels of connection. But until that connection is affordable and reliable, one can't actually build your livelihoods and wider development of it. So we do believe that keeping energy access and the inclusivity and affordability of that is core to where philanthropy can support. And in other areas, ensuring that this is a just transition. It's an easy phrase. It's extremely hard to deliver it with complicated, unequal societies that are geographically dispersed. It's very hard to make an economic case for all of that. So that's the sort of area that we think philanthropy should contribute.
Thank you, Simon. And I think that wider picture, maybe we'll sort of focus in a bit on the private sector and the role the private sector can play. And Nandita, I know that where you work, you took the decision to invest in emerging markets and invest in Asia and India in particular. And I wonder if you could share a bit about what led to that decision and what are some of the lessons you've learned from that experience on how we could replicate and scale those kinds of efforts.
Yes, thank you, Priya. You hit the nail on the head with the statistics you gave earlier in the introduction about the dollar spent and the impact that dollar could make. And we are strong believers of this. In early 2010-11, when we went from being an advisor at Thomas Lloyd Group in the renewable energy sector to being an investor ourselves and raised our first fund, we recognised the investment opportunity in Asia, and we believed in the investment opportunity in Asia for the next 2 decades, based on the fact that there was going to be this significant population growth, economic growth, and urbanisation. Therefore, there would naturally be a demand for energy and electricity. So those macro factors were there. But we also were early on did research in CO2 emissions and the carbon cost of GDP. And what we saw is that the 10 largest economies of Asia, with India being the largest one in terms of emissions, and India and China being the largest ones in terms of emissions, were emitting 4 times as much CO2 as all of Europe put together. So effectively, if you work out your carbon cost of GDP, which is CO2 emissions per $1 trillion, investing your dollar, pound, euro in Asia would give you 4 times an impact as it would in Europe or North America. And for us, that is being a pure play impact investor, it was clear we needed to focus, and we focused on emerging markets because of that. India is a big market for us. It's 50% of our mandate across our funds. And so, we have, in the last 4 or 5 years, spent efforts in building up our presence in India. In terms of lessons learned and mistakes made, infrastructure is, it's never straightforward. There are always hurdles and challenges, and whether that's at a country level, whether that's at a macro level of currency, etc. I would say our biggest lesson learned is to commit to a market and stick with it. So early on, we committed to other markets in Asia, like the Philippines. We've been there for 10, 11 years. And then 5 years ago, we committed to India, and we've stuck with it. So you have to ride the ups and downs and the waves of currency and other things if you fundamentally believe if you believe in the fundamentals of the market.
Thanks, Nandita. I think that's a really important message about sticking for the long term and making a decision and sort of taking the time it needs for those investments to show fruition. I'd like to move on to Keith, who's joining us online. Welcome, Keith, and ask you about some of the sort of risks that are involved in investing in emerging and developing markets, and how traditionally some of these risks have been a barrier to private investment. But given the urgency and the scale of investment that's required now, how you think the financial sector is sort of adapting to being able to meet this need?
Sure, thank you, and it's great to be here with all of you and fellow panellists. Look, I was just in India and in Mumbai a few weeks ago, and I must say I was really struck and left with a very strong sense of optimism about the boldness and the ambition levels of many Indian-based CEOs, far more so in many other markets, even in the developed markets, and Western Europe, etc. I also think, in a number of ways. Number one, I was struck by the boldness. Two, I was struck by the geopolitical opportunity for India as a whole, and that goes into your point about risk. That actually what's occurring, especially vis-a-vis China, obviously the war in Ukraine, is that there is a massive opportunity for India that can include domestication of production, for example, of solar inputs, given the land mass, given the opportunity to convert that into undersea cable for power export, or into green hydrogen as export for internal use, also for export. India can become a major exporter of green energy if it invests appropriately. And I can sense that from many of the CEOs as ambition levels. Now, what does that mean? It means finance. It will need a lot of capital to go into India to support this ambition level, this vision, but also the geopolitical opportunity that's opening up for India. To do that, however, I think that finance, because the theme of this event is around reinventing and reimagining and rethinking. There is no doubt that we need to reinvent and rethink finance. Right? We are talking about multiple sectors that we need to effectively revolutionise over the next 10 years or so. Energy systems, food systems, even our education system. Finance has to be part of that reinvention as well. As we all know, it is still far too short-term in thinking and in calculations when it comes to day-to-day decision-making. Secondly, it is not intentional enough, meaning it's not driven by a clear purpose beyond financial returns. It must take into account environmental and social returns as well. And that was another thing that really struck me in a positive way in Mumbai, is how many of the CEOs were talking about, and I think, Simon, you mentioned it, the just transition, the people factor. We will not succeed in these transitions if we focus just on technology and just on the systems. It is fundamentally a social issue. And the just transition, with all its complexities, needs to be factored into these decisions. And I was impressed how many of the CEOs and senior leaders are thinking about their finance has to be part of that. At the moment, it's not. And so, again, I was attending a B Corp event in Rome just last week, where it was a whole 600, 700 people involved in effectively the purpose, the mission of business. And finance was a key part of that. But that is a key element that we need to factor into the finance to ensure that it flows to the emerging markets. India is a key one. And that is a reinvention of finance that we need to be driving. It needs to become more long-term. It needs to be factoring in the externalities, positive and negative, social and environmental. And that means also the creation of new funds. So again, to your question about risk, there needs to be a risk-return paradigm, right? You can't just change the strategy of a fund or investment strategy overnight. You need to create new ones. We've seen some green shoots because we have seen in the last 18 months the creation of a number of new, for example, energy transition funds. We need many more of those similar strategies. Nature and biodiversity, food systems. That's what we really need to be driving with greater intentionality in those strategies, an appropriate risk-return equation as you raise those funds, and also a geographic perspective, because we all know that we need to get the capital into these emerging markets. And clearly India will be and will need to be a big consumer of this capital that we need to shift into the region. Thanks.
Thank you, Keith. I think a really important message there about reimagining and rethinking finance to meet the needs of today. Delphine, I know you've been focused on a lot of infrastructure investment. And when you're looking at where and how to invest, how important are the regulatory conditions in terms of your decision making, and what are some of the regulatory conditions that you look for?
Yeah, thank you. So OMERS is a Canadian pension fund. We've been investing in infrastructure in the UK for more than 15 years and in India for close to 5 years now. And as a long-term institutional investor, it's very important for us to invest in companies that generate stable and predictable cash flows, because ultimately we have pensioners, we need to pay their pensions. So we are looking for certainty and predictability of cash flows. And from that perspective, I fully agree with what Simon was saying before. I think the government has a crucial role to play to enable investments in the country, in the energy transition, in the green mobility and other sectors. And the role of the government, as I see it, is really to frame the regulation and the market, design the regulation and the market that will incentivize private capital to invest more in the country and to do so for the long term, like OMERS. And so, for example, if we think about renewable energy, the Indian government has done a really good first step in terms of setting ambitious targets, setting a framework in terms of long-term purchase price agreements that enable institutional investors to see long-term cash flows. But there is more to do to be able to achieve the target by 2030 to generate 450 gigawatts of renewable energy, but also to deal with some of the additional complications that come with that. For example, the fact that renewable is not generating baseload power. You need to build a transmission and distribution network to transport this power. And so there is more that needs to be done to enable the transition. And it's also in relation to sometimes simplifying and supporting the process. For example, permitting is a very complicated process for developers in India. And so being able to actually enabling the development by simplifying the permitting process, the land acquisition also can be very difficult for developers, is really needed to scale up the investments that are required in the sector. And then maybe finally, because this conference is about finance and technology, I see a lot of potential in the technology in India. There is a lot of the innovation ecosystem is really functioning well, I think. But what is needed is really how to scale up this ecosystem and make it investable by institutional investors like us, because we wouldn't take technology risk, for example. So how do you scale this up and make these long-term businesses that can support the energy transition and the wider climate investment going forward, I think is going to be key for India in the future.
That's really helpful, Delphine. I think a clear message about the importance of easing sort of processes and easing the burden around transactions. And Jagjit, I wanted to ask you about some of the experiences that India has had with being sort of relatively successful in terms of developing renewable energy, despite some of the challenges that Delphine mentioned. India's been a real success story on solar energy. And how, at the International Solar Alliance, are you sharing some of those lessons and experiences and working with other countries to be able to attract investment into solar energy?
Thank you, Priya. First of all, thank you to IGF for inviting International Solar Alliance to this very, very important and timely discussion. Regarding your question about how India did it so successfully and what International Alliance is doing to share it across, we look at our members and the developmental challenges they have in three broad buckets: energy security, energy access, and energy transition. And many of our members, now 107 in number, they grapple with more than one challenge at one time. If you look at countries in Africa, they are struggling with access issues, with security issues. In Europe, countries are struggling with security and transition issues. And in India, we have seen huge successes in energy access, but energy security and transition are big issues. Over the last 10 years, we have seen phenomenal growth in solar, in both off-grid and grid-connected solar projects in gigawatt scale now, if you put the numbers together. What we are trying to learn from India is how India is moving forward with electrifying its sectors of economy and greening this electricity. Ultimately, if we are serious about energy transition, we need to bring a lot of green electricity to all sectors of economy. Storage and hydrogen would play their own part. And at ISA, we are pushing for 24/7, making solar the base load, whether it's pump hydro or battery storage, and putting them all together and making it financially viable for various kinds of consumers, whether you talk about residential, industrial, or official sector. So coming to finance and how we saw in India and the way we are trying to take it out is the financing story could be seen in three buckets again. We have seen a scale up of clean energy finance. We have seen a shift from brown to green, and we have seen optimization where new financial structures have come in. Now we see asset monetization, refinancing, blended finance structures, and public-private partnerships coming together, while the regulatory side is getting more and more firm and clearer. At International Solar Alliance, annually we produce our flagship report. We call it Ease of Doing Solar, building off what World Bank used to do, Ease of Doing Business, essentially analyzing countries' investment environment for its readiness to attract solar investments. India has been a shining star along with a few other developing economies like Brazil, Saudi Arabia, and others. And we have taken these lessons of policy reforms, of regulatory processes, of financing structures to other ISA member countries. More concretely, there are a few streams of financing which we are analyzing and working more closely. One are institutional investors. This audience knows, many of them are institutional investors themselves, that even today, with all the commitments at Glasgow, their exposure to clean energy assets are about 3 to 4%. While they sit on, multi-trillions of dollars, the exposure is very little. At ISA, what we're trying to do is have a curated conversation with these institutional investors who want to increase their exposure in major economies, India and beyond. And we are trying to put pooled financing structures with funding coming from various sources which could absorb the first loss, including the organization which Simon is leading. GIAP and ISA have forged a partnership to utilize the grant money, the catalytic money coming from GIAP to do project preparation work, so that these institutional investors find the pipelines of projects where their funds could be invested. I'll leave with the final idea what ISA is doing. Again, building on lessons what we saw in India. In India, over the last many years, wearing my former cap at the World Bank, climate investment funds provided about $800 million of concessional money through blended financing structures, taking first loss, providing guarantees and others through national banks and private sectors. Similarly, we are trying to put together concessional financing with private sector and grant money through a blended finance risk mitigation facility for our members in Africa. Essentially, the idea is to take Indian lessons, Indian technology, and India entrepreneur to invest in Africa, supported by this blended finance risk mitigation structure. Finally, on the technology side, while we focus so much on finance, we need to realize that if solar and other renewable energy have to play their part in decarbonization efforts, their manufacturing capacity has to increase multifold. Over the last couple of years, we have seen supply side risk for a variety of reasons. So another effort which ISA is pushing is to diversify and scale up global manufacturing bases. We'll see how far we progress, but financing and technological growth and innovation have to go side by side. Let me conclude there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jagjit. And thank you to our whole panel for this very fascinating discussion. I think there's clearly some strong messages about the role both the financial sector has to play in terms of reimagining the way it kind of thinks about finance, but also the role that governments need to play in setting the right enabling environments and the right policy frameworks and infrastructure to be able to attract private investment. And the UK with the sort of experience that it has around finance, and India with the sort of experience that it has around some of the successes around renewable energy and innovative technologies, can prove a really strong partnership and match in driving this agenda forward. So with that, I would like to thank all of my panelists and thank also all of you for being here and the India Global Forum organizers for convening this, and invite everyone for a 15-minute break before we reconvene. Thank you.
Thank you.